Hello and welcome back to the Skeptic Track. Thank you so much for joining us. We have an old friend of the track here today. He gave a wonderful presentation last year, and he's back with all new material this year. Please welcome Blake Smith from Monster Talk.
All right. Thank you so much for coming, DragonCon 2024. Woo! All right, cool. So I'm Blake Smith. I am the host and producer of the show Monster Talk, the science show about monsters. I'm a big fan of monsters. Been doing this show since 2009, and I love coming to DragonCon. So I wanted to do a panel this year about werewolves, and I've been doing this work for a while. So I want to, first of all, though, I want to thank Derek for running the track, Angie for her help, Mark back there. This is such a great setup. I love the fact that you can watch this streaming. So even if you're across the show, across in another hotel, one of the many hotels here, you can still catch up what's happening right here on the YouTube channel, which is great. So Monster Talk actually was born here at the con in 2008. Had some conversations. I think James Randi was there that year. It was a good year. I met my co-hosts, and we sort of got the idea to do this show after about a year of thinking about it. And it is the science show about monsters. We try to promote science and critical thinking and skepticism while also loving monsters and monster-adjacent material. So anything could be a monster. We definitely talk about UFOs, which are not monsters, but they often contain aliens in the stories, and those are kind of like monsters. So ghosts, fairies, Bigfoot, any kind of cryptid. So check it out, monstertalk.org. So early on in Monster Talk, we wanted to talk about monsters that might be real as well as monsters that we know are not real. And one of the more interesting sort of monsters out there in the lore is the Beast of Gévaudan. Anybody here fans of Gévaudan know this story? Okay, so it's I say fans. It's an interesting story. Hundreds of people died, or more than 80 died for real. So there's some tragedy, but there's been time to get over it. So we had on a guest named Jay Smith, no relation to myself. He is a professor I believe at Duke, and he's a historian, and he specializes in French history. And he wrote a book called Monsters of the Gévaudan. And if you read that book, it's a really fascinating look at how this real tragedy happening in France, especially in rural France in the Gévaudan region, became widely known as a sort of supernatural monster story. And people will ask, what was the monster? Was it a wolf? Was it a dire wolf? Was it a prehistoric wolf? Was it a hyena? Was it, in the movies, a lion with armor? I mean, there's all kinds of things it might be. Jay's conclusion, after doing a lot of research back to the primary material, which he did through going to archives and also being able to speak and read French, I think that's also helpful. He came to the conclusion that what really happened in Gévaudan was that these monster stories arrived at the same time as the broadsheet newspaper. And so you had all these independent publishers looking for content, and people were fascinated by salacious and exciting stories about people being murdered, and they started to pick up any kind of story about these killings, and especially if they had weird details. And so basically you had a media burst causing this sort of, first of all, incredibly well documented, but not very well fact-checked surge in literature about monsters. So the killings were really happening, but any story that involved they tried to shoot it and nothing would kill it, or they tried to hit it with swords and nothing would kill it, or the dogs were afraid of it, or just all kinds of strange details that got put into these broadsheet newspapers. Now, obviously, we're in a different world now, and you would never have crazy stories taking over the media with no fact-checking. So, but we still found it interesting and relevant. So, in the original lore about this monster, there was a beast that was killed under, I guess, the auspices of the king. He hired hunters to go out and kill it. There were lots of soldiers and other people looking for this monster, trying to kill it. The royal killing, the one that a lot of people thought was going to take care of the problem, didn't take care of the problem. The killings kept happening. And then a local named Jean Chastel went out and did his own hunt and killed a very large wolf, which they said was the beast. And then the killings petered out. Now, if you go back and listen to our coverage of that or go read Jay Smith's book, you'll find that no, that's not exactly what really happened. The killings did sort of continue because they were really a product of wolves, local wolves, actually killing people. And that's not even new. There were a lot of people that died here, but less than 100 years before, there had been another sweep of wolf attacks, and nobody turned it into a supernatural story, but they were also not happening in this hyped up media environment that was relatively new thanks to technology. So I really enjoyed the conversation with Jay Smith, and I really enjoyed reading his book and this research because it took this mysterious story that I didn't understand and turned it into a real historical event that was incredibly contemporary because it was really about how the stories that we tell change the way everyone perceives what's going on and the way that the media influences it. And because those broadsheet newspaper stories still exist, that you can still go back and see how all these different details sort of coalesce into this, there's a giant monster, it's killing people, even though it was actually probably lots of different wolves that were local to the area. But one thing that Jay didn't answer that I was really curious about was why, if you go read the lore today, you'll read a story that says Jean Chastel, he did the killing, but that he killed the beast with a blessed bullet and it was made of silver. And that's a very specific detail. And I wanted to know where it came from because it's definitely not in the source material. It's not in the historically like contemporaneous literature at all. But that led me to this long research into werewolf lore, which we're going to be talking about. So first, let's talk about what is a werewolf, because even though some people thought that the Beast of Gévaudan might be a werewolf, mostly it was just a supernaturally large wolf. There's no stories about it changing into a person or anything like that. But I think we could all agree that now, in the present day, a werewolf is a person who changes into a wolf and then back again. But if you go to read about werewolf history, like the history of the literature of werewolf, the history of the stories about people changing shape or being turned into animals are very ancient, going all the way back to the legend of Gilgamesh. So in the legend of Gilgamesh, at one point, he is dating a goddess, and she wants to get married, and he says, well, I'd like to get married. It sounds really awesome, except remember like your last boyfriend who was a shepherd, and he had all these sheep, and how you got mad at him and turned him into a wolf and then had his own hounds tear him to pieces. I don't want that. That's no way to have a relationship. So that's really, it's just a tiny little part of the Gilgamesh legend, but it involves a man being turned into a wolf. And then in Greek mythology, we have King Lycaon, who famously had dinner for the gods and tried to check out how good they were at, their palate by serving them his own son to see if they could detect the swap. It wasn't lamb, it wasn't beef, it was my kid. And so it turns out the gods could detect it, and they really didn't like that trick, and they got mad at him, and they turned him into a wolf. So, like you do. And then from the Greeks, we go to ancient Rome, and this is where we start to see what I would say more real classical werewolf stories. Classical is not a joke. But in the Satyricon, there is a really complete, it's a very short story about a werewolf where a guy wants to go, he's in love with a lady who is an innkeeper, and she has a husband. But when her husband dies, he immediately wants to go pay his respects and get ahead of all the other potential suitors because he really cares about her. So he goes that way, but he travels with a friend who's staying at the same house, and his friend is a Roman soldier. And on the way, the Roman soldier sets up a circle of stone, takes all his clothes off, puts his clothes into the circle. His clothes magically turn into rocks, and then he turns into a wolf, which is quite terrifying. And so the man runs off to his girlfriend's house and explains what's going on, and ultimately they find out that the soldier is a werewolf. So it's a pretty classic werewolf story. Definitely involves full transformation. There's also another Roman story about the Neri of Scythia, and that is a local but far away place. I guess it's a neighborhood. I guess neighboring country. And in the legend of the Nereid, they do this ritual where they take off their clothes, they swim across a lake, they turn into a wolf. And there's different versions. In one version, if they don't eat any meat for like 7 or possibly 10 years, that they can swim back, their clothes will be restored to them, and they'll become back human again. And it's again full transformation from man to beast and back to man. So that, again, werewolf. By the Middle Ages, werewolf lore is pretty common. It gets really associated with witch trials. There were these separate werewolf trials. Now, I've always heard that, and only recently sort of started to track down quantifiably how different this was. So, uh, some of the numbers, the number of witches killed during the witch trials over the years that those took place, might have been higher than 10,000 witches killed, mostly women. In the werewolf trials, mostly men. It's probably 200 to 300 that I've been able to find so far. I want to get that more quantified, but the point being, it's by an order of magnitude smaller amount of people being involved. But the outcomes were generally the same. If you were found guilty of being a werewolf, they killed you. So by the 19th century, we had this interesting rise in the collection of folklore. I'm sure you're familiar with the Brothers Grimm and their work on collecting German folklore. It gets published in English. And the idea of collecting local folklore becomes a big part of building up a national identity in Europe. And that'll be really important because when World War I starts, you really need to know which nation you're fighting for, I guess. But this rise in folklore gathering leads to sort of a lot of insights in, like, look, here's the same story in a different country, or this has this different piece. And so the sort of slow professionalization of folklore really gets its start in the late 1800s. By the 1910s and 20s, and especially the 30s, you start to see pulp fiction in the English world just getting overrun with werewolf stories. They're great. And so, like, if you look online at Internet Archive, for example, you can find collections of werewolf stories that were in Weird Tales. And there's dozens and dozens of them by authors like Seabury Quinn, Manly Wade Wellman, but famous pulp writers. But you'll see that the stories themselves have lots of different elements that are not consistent. But that's going to all change in 1940 when the Wolfman movie comes out from Universal. Now, this is written by Kurt Siodmak, and he was a Jewish guy. He and his brother Robert were both in the film industry in Germany. And in the 1930s, it became a very unsafe place to be. So they fled. I think Robert went to America first. Kurt went to England, and there he made some movies. And eventually, he moves to Hollywood as well. He starts writing movies, but he writes The Wolfman, and in 1940, that's going to change werewolves forever. So in this talk, we're going to be talking about werewolf tropes. So I picked out 4. There's lots of different things that happen in werewolf stories, but these 4, I think, are some of the big ones. Full moons causing transformation. The idea that werewolf is the lycanthropy is a curse or a contagion, that it can be transmitted by a bite. Wolf's bane, or some kind of magical herbs being involved. And, of course, the one that I was most interested in, silver and silver bullets. By the way, this background picture is an illustration from a volume on ancient legends. I just love it. All these werewolves sort of standing against this wall. It's just a beautiful drawing. And you'll notice, though, that they are standing upright. And a lot of these wolf stories involve men turning into wolves, but they're just wolves. And there's a lot of confusion about whether they're natural or supernatural. But if you saw something like this, you would know, well, that's not a normal wolf. They're bipedal. It's weird. So we'll get back to that. So what is a werewolf exactly? Was Lycan a werewolf? I personally don't think the story of Lycan or the story of Gilgamesh really constitutes a werewolf any more than saying Anubis would constitute a were-jackal. That's not what that is. They were cursed and turned into these animals, but they weren't flipping back and forth. And I think the transformation back and forth is what really makes it a werewolf. But how did you become a werewolf? So again, now we tend to think of it as being a viral transmission. If you're playing a role-playing game, it's usually something like that. You get bit by a wolf as part of your character's backstory or whatever, because you need those bonus points. And no, I mean, werewolves in modern lore have become something a little bit like Jekyll and Hyde or the Incredible Hulk, where there's sort of this romanticized version of you're struggling against your urges, but you also get those incredible stat bonuses you don't want to give up. So building that into your character is really tough. But in the medieval days, you typically would see this as being the product of a satanic activity. So the simplest way would be to make a deal with the devil. That comes up a lot in the werewolf trials. But there are also a variety of folklore methods. Some of them involved vampires being killed and turning into werewolves, drinking from a wolf's paw, eating meat that was killed by a wolf, but it's like, it left the corpse, or you chase the wolf away and eat the corpse, and it somehow contaminates you with wolf. Um, but most interesting to me is the magical ritual, which would often involve a special salve, which would have things like belladonna and wolfsbane, all sort of these sort of psychoactive or potentially toxic chemicals. And then you would rub that on your body, and you would wear a wolf belt or a wolf pelt, and then you would be granted the power to turn into a wolf. Um, it, it, there's a sort of famous story about a guy named Peter Stump, or sometimes Stubb, who was killed in the 1500s. I believe we have a slide about him later, but he's one of the people who helped popularize this magic belt idea. He didn't. The people who wrote about him after he'd been drawn and quartered and murdered were the ones who wrote about it. But allegedly, he was a killer who was turning into a wolf and killed dozens and dozens of people. And so there's some very famous woodcut pamphlets that made it all the way to England that we have preserved, talking about this case. And it's interesting because I think a lot of people. Let me back up and say there's this concept called euhemerism. So how many of you ever heard that at the bottom of every legend there's a kernel of truth? You probably heard that, right? Well, that is most formalized in the idea of euhemerism. That was actually coming from ancient Greece, where it was postulated. I think his name was literally Euhemer. I think that might be right, but it's something like that. And he believed that the stories of the gods and all the Greek mythology were actually based on real events that have become contaminated over time and changed. And so while I don't think that there were really people turning into wolves, it is a common idea that maybe serial killer stories might be one explanation for werewolves. And I can't really tie that to a real case other than Peter Stump. And I don't really think that's exactly what was going on. There's a lot of other things with religion and persecution and other maybe mental illness happening there. So that's an interesting story that we'll probably explore in the future on Monster Talk. But by the 20th century, the pulp fiction, as I've said, is getting full of werewolf stories. But you start to see the emergence of the curse and the full moon in these stories. Robert E. Howard, you probably know from creating Conan the Barbarian, Called the Conqueror, a few other characters. He wrote these pulp fiction stories contemporaneous with H.P. Lovecraft, and he wrote two werewolf stories in the 1920s. One is in the Forest of Villefere, and one is called Wolf's Head. Wolf's Head is interesting for a lot of reasons, but one is that it uses a curse as the method by which the werewolfery is transmitted. It also involves a werewolf that is basically a human with a wolf's head, so it's that upright bipedal wolf. And by the 1930s, you're getting so many pulp fiction writers. They're writing all kinds of versions of these stories. Werewolves are hot by the 30s. And so when you get Kurt Siodmak writing The Wolfman in the 1940s and the sequels, he's writing that strain of interest. Like, so much like today, once you buy one thing at Amazon, you get 20 recommendations for the thing you literally just bought. It's the same idea that the market's hot for werewolves, so therefore we need to feed more werewolves into the system. All right, full moons. So you will find the full moon in many, many, many werewolf stories, but you will not find the full moon as being the cause of the transformation until much later. Even in this early story from the Satyricon, the full moon is a major feature. And in so many of these translations and old texts that I read to do this research, you'll find the silvery moon, and the moon was a crescent, and the moon was a full moon, and the moon, it shows up all the time. But if you think about it, these were being written at a time before electric lights, and you're trying to explain how come someone was walking around at night and able to see, and including the moon means you don't have to include a torch. It really makes sense as it was a natural part of the story, and there's not anything particularly required or necessitated for the moon to be in the story. It's a detail, but it's not a plot element. That changes, I think, in Robert E. Howard's 1926 story Wolf's Head, where the moon is tied directly to the change cycle. And it is, again, it is a curse. But it's not clear that it has to be a full moon. It's just that the moon ties into when the transformations happen. In 1941, when you get the Wolfman, there is a poem that's quite famous. It says, "Even a man who is pure in heart and says his prayers by night can become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the autumn moon is bright." Now, in spoilers, I'm going to spoil the Wolfman movie. He dies, okay? He is not killed by a silver bullet. He is killed by being beaten to death by a silver cane, also by his own father. It's a very tragic movie. It's really good. It holds up very well. But it was so successful that Universal wanted a sequel, but they had killed the wolf. So what they do is in 1943 they have a sequel, and in the sequel, it starts with grave robbers opening the grave of dead Larry Talbot under the light of the full moon. And the full moon revives him and turns him into a wolf. And then he basically wakes up with, well, obviously he kills some people, but then he comes to his senses as a human. He's alive again and has no idea what's going on. But they changed the poem. Now the poem says, "Even a man who's pure in heart and says his prayers by night can become a wolf when the wolfsbane blooms and the moon is full and bright." So not the autumn moon, and it clearly becomes the focus of the full moon for the rest of this movie. In fact, that's a big plot element going forward for the rest of the film and for the rest of werewolfdom, that the moon is a really important thing for the transformation, and that, again, tied with this curse idea. So, silver, I found to me, I always like learning new things about monsters, and I was so excited to learn that silver bullets were not really part of werewolf lore. I had heard it here and there, but I wanted to actually go back and do the research. So I've taken tons of notes on this, and I'm not going to share my bibliography for this talk, but if you go to monstertalk.org and look up werewolves, you'll find links to some documents where I've got dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens and dozens of werewolf links going back to old texts. Most of the time when I can, I give it online links so you can go read the original yourself. But what you'll find is that where silver bullets and shape changing prior to the dates we're going to get into here was always about witches. Did anybody see the Eggers movie, The Witch? The Witch? Did you guys see that? It's a really good story. That is one of the most amazing movies because if you watch it, it really, really, really captures what witch lore was like in the 1600s and 1700s. It's very accurate in that sense. It's this idea that that witches make deals with the devil and can shape change. Now, there are sort of two kinds of witches. You've got witches who are humans who get involved in magic and the supernatural and make arrangements with the devil to have a contract. It's, classic almost Faustian type stuff. But there's another kind of witch, which is the evil creature that looks like a human but has superpowers. So if you think Baba Yaga, that's more of a sort of folkloric entity that is a witch versus the I'm a human being doing witchcraft, which is, again, yet another thing from, say, I'm a pagan or I'm a Wicca, So modern witchcraft has very little to do with the conception of witchcraft in medieval times or this sort of supernatural creature, the witch. But there is a sort of classic witch story. You're a farmer and you're plowing your field and you see a strange looking hare or you see a weird cat. And, you're a farmer, so like you do, you go get your gun to shoot it because you're a farmer. Did I say you're a farmer? You're totally a farmer. Anyway, you try to shoot this animal and your bullets have no effect. And you certainly didn't miss because you're a farmer. So you're hitting it, but it won't die. It just won't die. Nothing you do will kill the hare or will kill the cat. So, frustrated, you eventually think maybe, and this is crazy, but maybe this is supernatural. And so you take a button off your best Sunday shirt, it's made of silver, you load that in your gun, and then you shoot the hare or the cat, and you'll knock a leg off, you'll knock an arm off, you'll knock an ear off, and the animal will flee. You definitely hit it, but it didn't die. And then some old woman in town will suddenly have a broken hand or a broken arm or a missing ear, and you go, ah, she's a witch. And she confesses when you yell at her about it. And so that's the classic witch story, which will sound a lot like a werewolf story, except that the werewolf stories didn't have silver bullets. So by the late 1800s, you start to see mentions in the werewolf lore of silver bullets being tried, but they don't kill the witch or the werewolf. So yet by 1915, I'm finding references specifically to silver bullets in werewolf lore. But these are not in stories, these are in more like monster academic texts. So I was trying to figure out how that happened. So I kept poking around. And by 1930, there's a story, I think it's called The Silver Bullet, which is literally like the perfect werewolf story where they find out there's a werewolf, they track it down, and they shoot it with a silver bullet, and then it turns back into a person, just like in the movies. So what's going on there? Well, I believe that what is actually going on comes down to James Fraser's Golden Bough. So I mentioned how that folklore was starting to be professionalized. Fraser is a massive collector of folklore, and especially about folklore around magic and witchcraft and but all kinds of folklore. But his book that he publishes, The Golden Bough, the original edition, is so popular, it kicks off some interesting effects. Like, for example, you may have heard of a guy named Aleister Crowley. He was involved with a group called the Golden Dawn, sorry. And the Golden Dawn was a magical Western esoteric group operating out of England in the late 1800s, had lots of famous people involved. And what they were effectively doing was they were trying to take James Fraser's Golden Bough and turn it into a functional magic book, that, make it into a grimoire, basically. And so they were trying to systematize magic. They were trying to do a lot of things, but among many things that they were trying to do, systematizing magic so that you could get reproducible effects. Now, it might also just be a lot of rich people, having fun on the weekends playing dress up, but it has a big cultural impact. Ultimately, I would say it's one of the things that leads to Gardner in the 1940s actually creating the religion of Wicca, which is taken quite seriously. But you don't see a lot of people trying to keep the Golden Dawn. It's not dead, but both Crowley splits off and makes his own religion called Thelema. But again, all this is coming. I don't think any of that would have happened without Fraser's Golden Bough. Well, his book is so popular that he keeps expanding on it. In 1912, he releases a multi-volume set. And in volume 7, there's a whole section on animals that are shape changers in folklore. And on one page in that section, there is a big portion talking about werewolves and how they can be killed and what they do. And immediately, not in a new chapter, but just going into the next paragraph, it starts talking about witches and using silver and silver being required. And after that, I see again and again people referring back to Fraser and talking about the silver bullet. So this is circumstantial, but I can't find anything earlier than Fraser's 1912, and I can see it on the page how someone could easily conflate the two ideas. So I would say there's a strong circumstantial case to be made that Fraser's Golden Bough is really the culprit here for what really gets these two concepts mixed. Now, it may have been inevitable, but because so many pulp writers like to reference Fraser, especially mainly Wade Wellman, it comes up a lot in his writing. I think it's a strong circumstantial case. I'm going to be writing that up as a journal article for the Journal of Gods and Monsters out of Texas Tech. So, Texas State University. So stay tuned for that. By 1916, just a few years later, the Encyclopedia of Religion and Ethics explicitly says that silver is required to kill a werewolf. But then, again, 1930, you get it in that short story. Again, it's spotty, though. By 1941, though, you get the silver cane and the wolfman. In 1943, the full moon gets in there. In that one, the werewolf is killed by the collapse of a dam. And in 1944, in House of Frankenstein, the Wolfman shows up yet again, still played by Lon Chaney Jr., still Larry Talbot, and this time he's dispatched with a silver bullet. So it takes up to 1944 before you literally get the silver bullet. But that becomes a massive trope. But if you think about it, though, it's still not 100% because I think it's 57 you get I Was a Teenage Werewolf, and they just shoot the monster to death. In fact, in the early 1980s, there's a couple of movies that come out. You get The American Werewolf in London and The Howling in one year. I think it's 80, 81, 80? I can't remember. It's around there. In one, you need a silver bullet, and in the other, the police shoot the werewolf to death. Spoilers. So, but great movies, tremendous special effects. You'll also notice that in American Werewolf in London, the wolf is like a wolf. He runs around on all fours. It's very much a big wolf. Whereas in The Howling, they're humanoid wolves, and they're really cool. I like both those movies very much. My wife prefers American Werewolf in London. But equally interesting to me is where we find these things is where it's not found. Two books in particular are absolute critical if you're building a library of werewolf lore. Sabine Baring Gould's book on werewolves and Montague Summers' book on werewolves. Neither of which mentions silver bullets and werewolves being a requirement. Now, Monty Summers does talk about witches and silver bullets, but that's 33, so he's working well after Fraser. But the fact that he doesn't, and Buddy, if it's written about werewolves, he sticks it in that book. That is an amazing book. He does. I would say definitely check out that book, but you might want to keep Google handy because he's one of those people who really liked his classical education. So when a quote was in Latin, he kept it in Latin and didn't translate it. If it was in Greek, he kept it in Greek and didn't translate it, and just assumes that you will have taken the time to learn Latin and Greek on your own. Why are you reading his book if you haven't? Come on. So, good scholarship, crazy guy. But none of that actually answers my big question of when did the silver bullet enter the lore of the Beast of Gévaudan? Now, as you've seen, I've done a lot of research on this. So, in the 19th century accounts, including Abbé Porcher's The Beast of Gévaudan in 1889, it mentions a blessed bullet, but not a silver bullet. I looked through so many books. I found a book, there was a book written by a woman who used past life regression to write her novels, which I thought was pretty fascinating. She wrote a book called A Lot to Remember, which is her own autobiography. But most of her other books are also autobiographical, but they were like when she was living in Egypt in ancient times, you know. So certainly saves time to research if you just remember everything. But she wrote a few years before John Keel. She wrote in, I think, 66, A Lot to Remember. And she mangles the story of the Beast of Gévaudan and includes the element of a silver bullet. But her book is not that popular. It just isn't. John Keel, though, you'll know John Keel from the Mothman prophecies. If you've ever heard of Mothman, it's because of John Keel. And he wrote a book in 1970 called Strange Creatures from Space and Time. And in that book, he recounts the story of the Beast of Gévaudan, and he adds the elements that Chastel had to have a silver bullet, and he had to have his bullet blessed. And so his book then goes on to be cited by other paranormal literature. And so by the 1980s, it's very common to see this. By the 1990s, it's very, very common. And by the 2000s, it is just known. Everyone knows that the way the Beast of Gévaudan died was that Jean Chastel took a silver bullet, had it blessed by a priest, and then went and killed the monster. It just happens to not be true. So I find it fascinating that when we first started out doing Monster Talk, we had an interview with historian Brian Regal, who teaches at Keene University. And he had been giving a talk. Oh, by the way, you should definitely check out, if you like monsters and history, you should check out Regal's work. He's written probably the definitive history of cryptozoology called Crackpots and Eggheads. And it is, that's their words, but it's a really beautiful history of how we went to the world of cryptozoology today. In fact, there's a lot of controversy, and I've just covered this on the show, because in essence, cryptozoology was originally conceived to be a hunt for hidden animals. It was a hunt for animals that were real and natural, but people didn't know about them except through folklore. So over time, when people have not found the monsters that they were looking for, whether that's Bigfoot or the Yeti or the Loch Ness Monster or werewolves, whatever the monster is, when they can't find the body, they start to think maybe it was magic, maybe it was multidimensional, ultra-dimensional, maybe these animals have secret powers, maybe they're aliens from another planet. All kinds of things that are definitely not amateur biology. There's something else. They're more like folklore. And so a question that I keep having is it still cryptozoology at that point? Or is cryptozoology only when you're looking for a natural creature? Because I know it's very much an amateur's field, and lots of people enjoy it. I certainly enjoy it, but if you're not looking for natural monsters or natural creatures to explain these monster stories, what are you really doing? So Riegel gives this story in 2009, and what he's basically saying is Darwin killed the werewolf in this sense. Prior to the work of Darwin to develop natural selection and evolution as a theory to explain speciation, people still had it was not completely unreasonable to imagine, well, we have different species, maybe sometimes things change into something else. That idea of transformation. There's plenty of places in nature where things make metamorphosis or change gender or change shape over the course of a life. So it wasn't entirely crazy to think maybe sometimes animals change into other animals. But after Darwin, and eventually genetics, you get this idea that things don't change over time except within the rules set up by DNA. So I liked that talk, and I don't want to argue with Brian about it. I think he's largely right. But that doesn't stop culture from continuing to look for magical and supernatural explanations. So in the late 1980s, we get the rise of something called Dogman. Y'all heard of Dogman? Beast of Bray Road? So it's a very, very popular idea in the cryptozoology world right now. I don't know if it is cryptozoology, but it's a very popular idea. Some people who are hardcore cryptozoologists and believe in Bigfoot think that when people report Dogman, what they're really seeing is either an upright primate that has a long snout like a baboon, or they're seeing a bear, which is pretty funny if you think about it, because I think bears explain a lot of Bigfoot sightings. But for them to explain Dogman is definitely a bear, but otherwise it's Bigfoot, is a little special pleading. It's kind of funny. The Beast of Bray Road is a funny story, though, because if you've looked into it, and again, it's a very popular idea right now. You'll see it all over TikTok and YouTube, podcasts. It originally starts on Halloween night when a mother and her daughter are attacked by a werewolf on Halloween night. Which is kind of funny, because if you're going to be attacked by someone who's upright and looks like a wolf, Halloween has two plausible explanations. Well, one's a little more plausible. One explanation is that Halloween night is the night when the realms get thin and the supernatural bleeds in. And so it's easier to talk to the dead, and that's a really popular time for the supernatural to happen. So that's one. The other one is that people put on costumes. And it's possible that someone had a werewolf outfit and just banged on the car and scared the crap out of some people on Halloween night. So I don't know which is the right answer. It's impossible to say. Okay. But it really took off. And so you got the Beast of Bray Road. There's the Michigan Dogman. There are several famous sightings. There's a video. There's the Gable movie, which was a hoax. But these really powerful and influential stories have taken over. Like again, what are we doing? We're telling stories. That's what we do. We're humans. Stories are so important to us. If it's not stories that you hear that are interesting, it's the stories you tell about yourself. It's the stories you tell about your friends. Everything exists in a narrative context in our world. And so to me, it's fascinating to track this stuff and try to understand where it comes from. So over time, stories change. I think we've talked about pretty clearly here within the werewolf world how ideas change over time. I wanted to give an example though in the Rougarou. Have you guys heard of the Rougarou? This is a New Orleans area werewolf type creature. But in France, again going back to the Beast of Gévaudan, and a reminder again, just to be clear, I didn't see a lot of contemporaneous lore talking about the Beast of Gévaudan being a werewolf, but that's a super popular idea right now. Um, but they have in France, they would call a werewolf a loup-garou. And in Canada, there was a group of people called the Acadians. They are French speakers who lived in Quebec. Between 1775 and 1778, they were evicted from Canada, and a lot of them made their way down the Mississippi to New Orleans and into Louisiana. Over time, the word Acadian got changed. Acadian, Acadian, Acadian. It slowly just metamorphed into Cajuns. So Cajuns are the results of the Acadians intermarrying with the local Creole people and their culture and language changing over time. But one of the other things that changed over time was the loup-garou became the rougarou. So if you see a rougarou, it will look very much like this creature, these wolves standing up in the background here. It's an upright werewolf, and it has become a general purpose boogeyman to scare kids. It's a thing that can get you in the swamp. It's a monster that can attack you for a lot of different reasons. It doesn't seem much like a werewolf, although sometimes the stories do involve shape changing. But it is very clearly descended from the loup-garou. And the changes that happen over time, that's a big part of what we like to look at on Monster Talk. It drives a lot of my research. I love seeing how story elements change. And you can never tell. You can never tell what's going to happen. Because once they get out in the wild, these things transform. The original meaning may be there, it may not be preserved, and we have no control over it. It's a natural selection process, which is really funny to me because how many of you know about memes? You've heard of memes, right? You're laughing because everybody knows what memes are because they're the pictures you see on the internet, right? But that's not what memes started out as. In 1976, they were created by Richard Dawkins as a concept in his book, The Selfish Gene. The Selfish Gene is a book about the idea that what's really being preserved through natural selection is not the individual. Ultimately, it's the genome. The genome is the thing that's trying to be preserved. I mean, he calls it the selfish gene. That's overstating it. That's on purpose. He's trying to get your attention. But in this work, he says basically, it's not, even though any individual may survive, they're not going to survive ultimately. The thing that gets carried on is not the individual, it's the genes. And so genes that have a better survival trait will go on and be carried forward. He hypothesized that genetics are not the only area where this might happen. He said, wait, what if ideas could do this? Ideas can be transmitted. Ideas can change over time. So let's call it a meme instead of a gene. And it's just this idea that as ideas transmit and get preserved, some will be more successful than others. Some will change and become new things. Some will die. It's the same as a life form, but it's just an idea. And I can't help but laugh at the irony that this incredibly useful concept, this little metaphor or parallel idea to genetics, got copied and transmitted over time and changed to the point that everybody thinks it's a cat video now. That's astonishing. Like it was this really complicated idea about how ideas are transmitted and changed, and mostly people just think it's sticking an animated GIF on a tweet or an X or whatever they're called now. So folklore can be looked at through a lens of memetics. Actually, though, folklore predates memetics by a lot, as we've seen. And one of the ideas in folklore is this concept of, they don't call them tropes, but it's this idea that these elements, these individual story elements, girl goes to see grandmother, big bad wolf, the girl changes into a fish changes into a girl. These little pieces of folklore have been combined into indexes so that you can search on them. But ultimately what they come across as memes. They're cataloged and they're tracked and they're shared, and people can take a story and they can figure out what elements are in there, like looking at the genetics of the story, which is just fascinating to me. But it's also important to remember that, besides my little forensics interest in where the ideas come from, it's also important to how are people using these stories? Why are they important? But one of the best and most interesting things to me is how stories change what people actually see. And this is disturbing in some ways because we like to think that what we look out and see in the world is what's really there. But really, if you do a lot of reading in neurology and how our perception works, you have little bits of delay in everything that you see, and everything that you sense, and everything that you feel. And our feelings are tied into what we experience and remember because they're all being stored in our brain. And when we store things in our smell area or our feeling, we have these, like, we don't just remember the events, we remember how things smell, the pumpkin pie smell, and suddenly we're back at grandma's at Thanksgiving or whatever. These memories are very much richer than just the literal textual content because of how we experience them. And our bodies don't sense things in the real. We're seeing things upside down. We have a blind spot that our brain fills in. The point being is there's a big popular question in online world about, are we living in a simulation? Well, I don't believe we're living in some giant alien computer, but I do believe we're all living in simulations that we're running in our own brains. We all live in a slightly detached version of the world. So it's kind of miraculous to me that we can all communicate and get along as well as we do. And it's pretty hard sometimes to get along with people or to understand what they're trying to do. But consider that we're all working through the intermediation of our senses and the limits of our bodies and brains. But influence. People see stories, read stories, and then they experience things driven in part by those stories. Those stories that we know affect the way we perceive the world. If you see someone taking an action and you don't know what's going on, you may be quickly checking your list of things that might be. I don't understand this action. Oh, maybe they're helping render aid because it's a medical emergency. Maybe they're robbing that guy. I don't know. You will build a story, though, because we don't like to carry around random events without putting them in a narrative. I saw a person who was doing this. I saw a person who was doing that. But in the monster world, the stories we hear literally affect how monsters are perceived. The go-to example for this would be the Yeti. Prior to the 1950s, if you saw a Yeti story and it was a Yeti sighting, it's going to be brownish or reddish. After Warner Brothers cartoons, the Bugs Bunny cartoon with their Yeti, and with the Bumbler in Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, the appearance of the Yeti in media changes to white, which makes great sense to us because, of course, it would want to hide the snow. That's not what the original lore said. But now you see people spotting Yetis as white, hairy creatures, and that is entirely happening, not because Yeti have changed to being white, but because our stories have changed them to be white, and now that's people, when people see a white, hairy thing in the wild, Yeti is a better explanation than anything else for a lot of people. So I find it crazy because, or I shouldn't say crazy, I find it fascinating that folklore drives perception and folklore drives fiction, and fiction changes folklore, and fiction changes perception. There's a constant interplay between folklore, fiction, and how people perceive things, and in the world of werewolves, it's an endless loop. That's my French joke. Before we go to questions, if you have time for, we have time for questions. But if be sure and check out other things on the Skeptrack. It's great that we're still doing this after all these years. I love this. Derek's done a tremendous job. Mark's doing a great job. Angie, thank you. Just is wonderful that you came over here to spend time here. And check out Monster Talk, monstertalk.org. It's available on all your podcast platforms. And next week I have an article dropping in Skeptic UK about memes and how brains work. So that might be fun to check out too. All right? Thank you. Welcome.
Hey, the werewolf trials that happened. Whoa, it's moving. Were there any tests that they made to determine if this person was a werewolf, or was it just immediately, you're a werewolf, we're gonna kill you?
That is a fantastic question. We have not. I personally have not been able to dig into the werewolf trial records. They're not in English that I've seen, so I'm trying to find a translation. There's a really good book in German that covers this stuff, but it's in German, and I don't read German. So until I can get a digital version that I can then translate, or I can find an English translation, I'm sort of stuck on that. I don't know the answer yet, but it's definitely one of the questions I want to know. I want to know more about what was going on at those trials. They're really interesting.
Yeah, incidentally, my question is also about the werewolf trials. I didn't know something like that happened. And what I found doubly interesting was you had that listed under ancient references. So correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding of the witch trials was
Middle
that there
Ages, 1500s, yeah,
yeah,
1400s,
yeah. So these werewolf trials, they must have preceded the witch trials then.
I think they were
If they're ancient.
They were contemporaneous. It was around the same time. The witch trials I don't think really take off until after The Witch's Hammer, the Malleus Maleficarum, is written, and so that book has all kinds of things about witches and shape changing in there, but not about werewolves at all. So I know that it was one of the things that sort of drove that the trials was the witch trial basically became a driver for the werewolf trials. But I feel like I'm not actually informed well enough to go into detail, but I will, because this is really important to me. So that's where my research is heading. I've done so much research for so long. I'm planning to put this all into a monograph, because I've got, like I say, 14 years of research and so many notes. I want to put it into one volume and with the complete bibliography, so you can just go check my work. Because some of this stuff is looking for something negative. You don't, without someone saying, I am introducing silver into the story, like until you have some definitive case, maybe someone did it before. And so someone could undermine my work, or I think enhance it by finding an earlier reference. So I'm always looking, and I don't mind being wrong as long as I also acknowledge that I'm wrong and improve my own research. So yeah. Any more questions?
Do you ever think that some of the historical, like in France and that kind of thing, in Gévaudan, do you think any of that was rabies, where you have wolves that are legitimately attacking villages and that kind of thing, and then you see someone starts to change? That could be maybe some sort of contagion aspect.
There is so interesting. That's a really good question. In the case of Gévaudan, I don't think it's necessary, because what we have lots of really good details about the particulars of those cases. It was almost always girls, almost always they were shepherdesses, and they were out with their flocks, and for some reason these wolves had become habituated to people. But there was something going on at the time, which was France had just been through some massive wars and was having a real famine. So everybody was starving, and including the wolves, and there wasn't enough prey. And so it's actually apparently easier to take down a human than a sheep. So and these girls, they didn't have much chance, right? And there's a lot of there was, again, in that particular case, there wasn't really any stories about transformation, but it's certainly possible that is a contributor. So again, that euhemerism tendency is it's really strong. I grew up reading monster books, and so you couldn't read a werewolf story without reading about the hypertrichinosis and other conditions there were things diseases that might be mistaken for vampirism, diseases that might be mistaken for werewolves. People with hairy body genes, they're hair on the face. It makes good sense, but there's not a lot of evidence that that's the real explanation. So that I guess that would be the answer. But a great question, like your armor.
Thank you.
Is that a Beskar? Is that what?
It's genuine. Very real.
Any other questions? You don't have to limit it to werewolves. I'll answer questions about any monster, or I'll try.
Hi, Dad.
Oh, hi. They're recording this. Well, I think with no more questions, we can wind up 6 minutes early. I could keep talking. Believe me, I could keep talking. But you guys could go check out Monster Talk at monstertalk.org, or check it out on your favorite podcast player. Wait, we got another question?
Hi, Dad.
Hi. I didn't realize that a third of us were my family. So anything to pad the crowd. Anyway, thank you so much for attending this talk. I really appreciate it. So.
Thank you.
Thanks, Angie.
I don't know what's this. Oh, yay. So thank you so much, Blake. That was wonderful. And there will be a corollary talk. What time is it, Hans?
4 o'clock.
4 o'clock
Awesome.
today in this room. that will expound upon the lunacy involved.
That's
So,
so cool.
yeah. So, anyway, thank you so much for joining us here on the Skeptic Track. We'll see you soon. Bye.
Yeah, that's a good question. You know, have you ever seen Amazon